Hear me? No. Okay. We'll have another go. Good afternoon. Can you hear me now? Thank you. Welcome to Policy Exchange. My name's Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange. I have the pleasure of chairing this fantastic event today. It's been an amazing 24 hours for us as an organisation. We just had a superb event on levelling up with former Director of Policy Exchange Neil O'Brien, now Minister for Levelling Up, Ben Houchen and others. Some of you may have also come to our In Conversation last night between Sajid Javid and Fraser Nelson of The Spectator, which are featuring on the front page of the Times today. But today's event, this event that you're coming to, is really the culmination of all of that. The turnout here, both qualitatively and quantitatively, is illustrative just of quite how important it is. It's been an amazing week for us in another sense, is that because of the reshuffle, we weren't sure we were going to have the same conference programme at all. So it's a great pleasure, and I just want to say, because it's a huge job to organise these events, to pay tribute to our events team, or everyone at Policy Exchange, but particularly to Robert Hansard, Oscar Bickett and Julia Misn, our Managing Director, for doing it. Please join me in applauding them, because it's a big deal. When I sent out the invitations, this is, by the way, in quantitative terms, the biggest panel we've ever had. I slightly fearfully sent out invitations, not expecting that many people would come to this event, and very speculatively, including to distinguished 22nd former Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, thinking that nobody would accept. And to my astonishment, he accepted and everyone accepted. So that's why we've got a panel of so many people. But they're here. They're going to speak 5 minutes apiece. Then we're going to throw it open the floor for questions, and particular pleasure on the subject of integrated review, because it's been so consequential, a Secretary of State for Defence, to be able to welcome Ben Wallace here today, who'll be kicking off, and then we'll be going over to others. So Secretary of State, would be so kind as to start off. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean, and thank you for inviting me. And it's nice to see a fully packed room full of human beings, rather than visual down the Zoom calls that we've all spent so long being enslaved to. And I'm delighted as a Lancashire MP that to welcome you to Manchester with our predictable Manchester weather, which we put on to keep the protesters away. Really, we noticed that the Corbynistas aren't really that tough socialists. They don't like the rain, and they soon go off and run away somewhere else. So I think welcome, and I think it's been for defence and security and the challenges of the world. It's sadly, but it's been a good year for us in delivering and proving why we need defence and security and why it matters to people. I think for many decades people have taken for granted the comfort they live in. They've taken for granted the interconnections that we depend on in the world, whether that's trade or whether that's information, whether that's intelligence. And COVID has brought into focus the consequences of not investing in resilience, or the consequences of what happens when globalization is interrupted, I think, is effectively. So I know that the title is the Integrated Review in the Wake of Afghanistan, and I think what Afghanistan did, in my view, was prove the need for the Integrated Review, and it proved the Defence Command Paper's ambitions were the right ones to have, which was a number of things. One is that we need readiness. We need to be ready as our armed forces, but also as a government, to deal with both global threats, but also domestic ones. And that means we have to work together to burden share across government. We need to make sure that we play to our strengths where we can. And yes, it was predominantly a defence evacuation of Afghanistan, defence-led, but it required diplomacy. It required relations with countries, the stans, ones that we often don't talk about, the Uzbekistans, etc., that people would say we haven't always in the past paid a great deal of attention to. It also shows that some of our international relations are not as good as they could be, and we need to invest in those, and that's how you obviously get out of that very difficult situation. But it also shows why Afghanistan does matter, I'm afraid, which shows that it is all connected. We are in a globalized world now. This is not the 1920s where people can pick and choose their partners and live in a sort of world of isolationism. It is all interconnected. Afghanistan matters, and who propped up almost immediately as the US and NATO was leaving, but China offering to, of course, invest in Afghanistan. And, of course, that was about securing land routes to ports such as Karachi and obviously into Pakistan. It is all connected. The ripples from Afghanistan will be felt by al-Shabaab in Somalia, and of course al-Shabaab pose a threat to British interests in Kenya and our friends Kenya. The ripples of another superpower being portrayed as defeated by Islamic terrorism will be felt across the world. But also, Afghanistan matters. If you are interested in Pakistan-India politics, it matters. If you're interested in Iranian politics, it matters. And that's why at the heart of the integrated review was a sense that we have to be joined up across government. We have to apply our strengths, whether that's cultural, science, economic, military, across the board. We have to apply intelligently our strengths to those problems. And that is how we are going to get ourselves in a position where our values and our common partners, our allies, all stand together. And finally, part of the integrated review is about alliances. I'm delighted to be sitting next to Australia and Canada and together because alliances matter. What do our adversaries not have? What does China and Russia not have? Friends. It doesn't have friends. Might have a few fair weather. I mean, if you define your friend as Belarus, you are in a pretty lonely place. No one's coming to your party. So I think, but we have friends. We have global friends. We have values that matter. It's definitely time that we stand up for those values, because the one thing that we are going to be tested on is our resolve. If you have time, watch Ronald Reagan's speech to both houses of Parliament that he made. I still think it's an inspiring speech about standing up for values and our allies and alliances and sticking together. What he said then is as true today as it was then. And I think, we are going to be tested. Tested in Ukraine, tested in the Pacific, tested in our values and our culture, tested in our economy. And only by sticking with our friends and our alliances are we going to be able to deliver that. That's what that IR was all about. I worked very closely with Liz Truss. I worked very closely with Priti Patel. The greatest thing when government works is seeing it work quickly and smoothly. Being able to pick up the telephone to Priti Patel when we came to evacuate through Arab people out of Afghanistan, clear away barriers in minutes rather than the usual system that would take weeks or days. That's when government works well at its best. This government has been tested. It's been a pandemic of global proportions. We've had Brexit, and now we've had things like Afghanistan. And I would say that Boris and the rest of the team has done a really good job in delivering this. Some of this is unprecedented. Some of this has been put on a shelf since the 1980s, and everyone thought about critical national infrastructure until WannaCry came and, if you remember, disrupted all us in the NHS outpatient system. And slowly but surely, this government is deliberately getting on top of that and delivering a good response to the challenges. I know our friends in Australia, our friends in Canada, all recognise the importance of that alliances. I talk to my Canadian counterparts about the High North. We don't call it the Arctic, we call it the High North for some reason. It's the latest jingo, but it's very important because, that is under threat. People want to move into the High North and the Arctic in a way that they haven't done before. That's why it's important I speak to my Australian counterparts, because suddenly large parts of the Pacific are in competition. It's why we have to forge stronger alliances with countries like Indonesia, because they matter in that sphere of the world. So I'm really excited that the IR, the Prime Minister's determination to deliver a defence settlement that broke the records in a sense, that £24 billion of extra money, the department that got a 4-year settlement. I know that's tough on some of the other departments, but it's important that we invest in security and defence. And because both the command paper and the IR recognise defence matters, we can't do it in stovepipes. We have to burden share with our allies. We also have to burden share across government. And I think Afghanistan actually proved the need for it. And I think it will now, the challenge is for me as Defence Secretary is to deliver. The challenge is to work with defence diplomacy. I spend more time often abroad now meeting my friends and allies around the world, some new allies, some more traditional allies. In July, I went round the world. I did have a day off in Hawaii, but that just happened where we had to change planes. But important, I found myself in Vietnam giving a speech in front of a hammer and sickle, which was reminded me of my time in Scotland, and it was really important, and it was because Vietnam feel the pressure from China, and we need new friends and allies as well as we go. But I think it's been a good review, a good defence paper, a Prime Minister that supports defence, supports security and sovereignty for British jobs. And I think Afghanistan, I'm afraid, proved it was the right thing to be in the right direction. And I think Afghanistan and many of those other problems will live with us for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that outstanding presentation. Now my great pleasure to call upon Policy Exchange's Chairman of Trustees, Alexander Downer, who was, as many of you know, previously longest serving Foreign Minister in Australia's history, then High Commissioner here in London. Many of you, the outstanding Foreign Minister of recent times for his country. I have to say that because he's my boss, but it also happens to be true. And in the old line, you know, insincere flattery is better than sincere flattery because it means there's some force majeure compelling it. But in all seriousness, Alexander, your presentation of the recent issues around AUKUS in your piece in the Telegraph was, I think, one of the most important statements of the principles around that and of the significance of that event for Brexit Britain, which was held by many critics of Brexit to be unable to forge new alliances in a post-EU world. And I know you've got many views on that, and we always look forward to hearing what you have to say, so thank you.
Well, thanks, Dean. Just in the few moments that I have, I just want, well, first of all, very warmly welcome the Secretary of State, and I must admit, endorse his very wise and enthusiastic comments. I suppose my observation is that this has been a pivotal period in British foreign and security policy, and when people 20 or 30 years from now look back, they'll see that this was a time when it fundamentally changed. Now, as Dean said, I was the Australian High Commissioner here until 2018. What you won't know is that my father was also the High Commissioner here. I mean, you have the House of Lords as a hereditary house. We have the Australian High Commission, and the point is that when my father was the High Commissioner, the British government under Harold Wilson withdrew from east of Suez, and for Australia, this was a very bad geopolitical point, where Britain decided it was going to become a regional player, not a global player. And I have to say, I think for a very long time that has been the case. Quite rightly focused on NATO and the North Atlantic relationship, the Soviet Union as it then was, and Russia, and understandably, but Britain was pretty much absent from the rest of the world. And what has happened through the integrated review, through, if you like, Global Britain, is that the government here have now decided to join with their friends and allies in other parts of the world, reconnect, if you like, and decide that the UK, and they've got the confidence to decide that the UK is a country which, one of the leading countries with fundamental liberal democratic values, and this world will be a more stable place if those values prevail. And the British government is not simply saying that the United States can carry the can, they can carry the burden, or that in the Indo-Pacific, Australia and Japan as America's key allies there, or India, they can do the job. The British government is saying it's going to become involved as well. And the integrated review talks about the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, which for us Australians is hugely welcome. Well, we go back a couple of years. Australia made the decision to buy the Type 26 frigate replacement, the British frigate, and hopefully that will proceed more or less on time. I think it's only a couple of years late at this stage. Ben, I wonder if you could speed them up a bit. But seriously, I think the development of what we call AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, over the last few weeks has been a seminal moment, has been a really exciting moment where Australia, working with the UK and the US, the three of the Five Eyes countries, have decided that there's going to be a transfer of technology of all kinds, but in particular of nuclear technology, and Australia will be able to build nuclear-powered submarines, which will make a major contribution to the power balance that we need in the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region. So, you know, my final point in the few moments that I have is that if we are going to keep this world stable and prosperous and successful, then the West, the liberal democracies, have to rally together more than they have done. And we've seen that, I think the Secretary of State reflected what many of us feel, without repeating what he said about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think he captured it very well. That is an abject lesson to us, that we have to start to show more resolve. And as Western countries, as liberal democracies, we have to coalesce together more firmly than we have done before. And the signs are good. The signs are there that the UK is back as a major player. The UK is making a contribution. And let's be honest, there is nothing easier than for us Australians to work with the British and the Americans and the Canadians on a good day. And the Canadians, nothing better. And it's been very exciting to see this transformation of British foreign and security policy.
Thank you. Thank you for a fantastic presentation, Alexander. Now, my great pleasure to welcome, first time onto a policy exchange platform, Alicia Kearns, MP for Rutland and Melton. I recently reviewed the Alan Duncan diaries for the Times Literary Supplement, her predecessor there, and of course before him, Michael Latham, before that Anthony Nutting. So there's something in the water about most Middle England of constituencies that leads to an interest in foreign affairs, security, defence policy yourself, with your own background there in the Foreign Office and MOD in communications in Iraq, Syria. Now, of course, a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the Commons. Look very much forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I think I got away in the Alan Duncan diaries with just one mention that I was very enthusiastic, so I'm sure that will come across today. We'll see how we go. It's a privilege to join you, Dean, and to join these distinguished speakers. I think, for me, the fallout of Afghanistan has seen a lot of people go, well, we need to throw everything out. This completely undermines everything. You know, we need to rethink where we are. But actually, that for me is fundamentally wrong, because the integrated review, its guiding principles are completely sound. And Ben has set that out better than I could possibly do. But what I want to do is talk about some of the issues in the IR that I think it brings into acute focus in terms of what we do in a more unstable and a less unreliable order. And I think the first thing is actually what I would call a constellation of allies. You know, Ben's talked about having friends. You need different friends for different theatres. America is still our foremost allies. And I have sat in meetings where people go, we need to reconsider America. They're not our friend anymore. They're not our partner. We can't rely on them. That's a fundamental misjudgment, and I think slightly hysterical. But we can't rely on them necessarily to bring the same amount of money, sheer numbers, and we have to be able to form alliances that can function without them in theatres where perhaps they are less engaged or less interested, or where they're less under attack than we are. The next thing in terms of allies is that we talk about this Indo-Pacific tilt, but to tilt, you need someone to lean on. And this is where our alliances become so important. And so we have to spend that time. And thank God Ben is out around the world talking to our friends and allies all the time, because that is how we're going to keep our country safe. AUKUS, a brilliant example. But that constellation of allies is about balancing a systemic competitor. We have numbers of different alliances. We have new alliances we need to form. We need to recognise different friends for different theatres and make sure we invest in them and build them. The next thing for me in the integrated review that Afghanistan really held up was the importance of the non-kinetic. First of all, we can't run away from train and assist, and that was very clear within the integrated review. Post-Afghanistan, people saying we can't do that. I would say the opposite. We need to lean into train and assist, but with a reduced footprint on the ground. We need to make sure that we're able to build that resilience within domestic forces, within domestic populations, within policies, the full gamut of what global Britain means, which isn't just about defence, it's about integrating trade, it's about integrating diplomacy, security, aid, you name it. But confidence is key. And post-Afghanistan, we do need to make sure that our partners can have confidence in us. It's not about saying we're there or we're not there. We need to have the confidence to say we can't do everything within an alliance, but we will bring certain things, and we will make sure that we use the might of the UK to bring about that alliance. When I've been at international negotiations, what the UK does that no one else does so well is bring countries together behind the scenes. We may not be the ones at the very front. We may not be there, for example, at the Syria peace talks. It was the US, the Russians and the UN that were the front. But it was the British behind the scenes that were making sure that diplomacy happened. It was the Britons that were bringing people together and making sure those discussions took place that needed to. So we need to recognise that we are fundamentally best placed to create new alliances to make sure they work and to bring people together, whether it's train or assist or others. The second is resilience. Now, obviously, post-Afghanistan, some of our enemies are going to be emboldened. There's no question of that. There's been a propaganda victory for some. So we need to make sure that when we look at resilience, we also look domestically. Have we inoculated those who are vulnerable within our country sufficiently against those who will seek to entrap them? Because actually, when we look at protecting ourselves as a country, the domestic is so important. And it's not just, again, about defence in the Home Office, it's about civil society. We need to look at every single level of our country and our society and make sure that in terms of hybrid warfare, which is nothing new, and it's fascinating that suddenly everyone's talking about the grey zone as if it's some kind of brilliant new invention, we need to make sure we are inoculating every single part of our societies because they are all under threat. The next is about investing in preventing instability, which again the IR is very clear about. We have the new conflict centre, which I lobbied for a long time when I was first elected. We need to make sure that we are using it to protect our interests through the non-kinetic and that we make it an effective part. And as part of that conflict resolution, it's about offering a genuine counter-offer, because those who are breeding instability and entrenching dependency are out there making offers to those middle countries that, for example, as Ben mentioned, we haven't necessarily engaged with as much in the past. That cannot continue. We must recognise it's not just enough to say that we want to stand against what they're doing. We need to offer an alternative to cutouts, to plunder diplomacy, you name it, that we're seeing. And my final lesson from the integrated review post-Afghanistan is that we cannot run away from enduring conflict. Forever wars we don't want, but remaining in place in a country and remaining strong and steadfast behind our allies is a sign of confidence and guts. It is not a weakness, it is not a failure, it's a recognition that stability takes time and you have to build from the ground up. So I think in conclusion, events, dear boy, events is a very common phrase. And Afghanistan, I think, is one where people could go one way and say, let's run away and start again. The integrated review gave us what we needed, and it recognised that our fundamental job is to keep our people and our interests safe. Now we just need to have the courage to go out and make sure that this government, which has said it will stand by defence, is given that support, that we go forward, have the courage to do what we need to do and protect our people, because we finally, thanks to Ben lobbying, have what we need. So now let's stand up, stand behind the IR and not run away because of what's happened to Afghanistan.
Thank you. Thank you for that outstanding presentation. Please come back next time as the first time. Thank you for that. Also, great pleasure to welcome for the first time onto Policy Exchange platform Matt Turpin here representing Palantir, to whom we express our appreciation today for sponsoring this event. Thank you. Matt also significantly was previously Senior Staff Director on the National Security Council staff on China, leading sinologist, for me at least, one of my heroes who sets the gold standard in these matters. As I say, never expected we'd get you here at a Tory conference, Matt, but you're here. We're delighted, and I think you'll agree with me afterwards that vaut le détour, as they say in the Michelin Guide. Thank you.
Well, Dean, thank you. And I feel extremely lucky to be on a stage with some really distinguished guests and panelists. It's a real honor to be here. And I've from afar, I have admired the work that the Secretary of State did through getting the integrated review out. I have to agree that this is sort of a fundamental shift. And I wanted to make a couple of points based upon sort of my reading of it and the kinds of things that I see sort of going forward. So first of all, I think the integrated review points out the way towards rejecting sort of the false choice between, on the one hand, security and our values, and on the other hand, prosperity and trade, as if these are separate things. And maybe we could have believed this in a world in which sort of a broader liberal international order was the international order that was winning out, and that largely the world was operating in a normative fashion, right? Everyone sort of followed the rules. But I think increasingly, as we witness sort of the world is developing today, increasingly we're seeing a non-normative world and in a liberal international order arising, and the weaponization of interdependence, and that understanding that is sort of at the base of the integrated review of having to bring these things together and having to formulate common policies across government to be able to do this, I think is incredibly important. I think it's increasingly clear to us all that we live in an age of sort of deep geostrategic competition, a condition that I think that many of us thought was relegated to the sort of the trash bin of history. We had sort of surpassed this era of geostrategic competition, and it appears to be back on us with a vengeance. And that requires us all to sort of rethink many of our assumptions that we had developed over the last 2 or 3 decades, and then to begin to reform ourselves in such a way to be able to deal with that world. All while doing things that have in mind of what are our basic values, of what we want to keep in place, and keeping those things in order. I think and maybe I'll sort of focus on sort of what I see as sort of the top objective of the integrated review, and I think it's right to focus on the strategic advantage of science and technology leadership. That focus I think is incredibly important, and I'd like to amplify that while leadership is important, I think there are 2 other aspects that also have to fit into it and force us have to sort of think many of our old assumptions. And those 2 other areas are, maintaining sort of a leadership not only in sort of the cutting edge of technology, but the industrial base and the manufacturing that you would need to be able to operationalize that, right? It's one thing to be able to sort of come up with the greatest and newest developments, but if you can't bring those to market and make those into real world things, it really is not leadership. And then the other one would be, I think that we have to sort of think very strongly about, how do we deny those advantages of those technological and scientific breakthroughs to our competitors, right? For years we had been sort of dismantling the ideas of export controls, the ideas around foreign investment screening, and we had sort of dismantled many of those things in order to ease trade within a normative world. And as that world begins to change, and those aren't exactly the positions we are in anymore, we need to rethink those tools, that not only is it important for us to run faster in science and technology, but it's also important to kneecap your competitor to ensure that they don't have those same advantages. I go back to General Dempsey, who was my boss in the Pentagon way back a long time ago. And his point was, we never want to go into a fight fair, right? We are always going to want to fight unfair. And that means giving our side advantages, and that means denying those advantages to others. And I think the integrated review certainly highlights those things, and I welcome that. So thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Matt. Now, my great pleasure to be able to welcome for the first time publicly onto a policy exchange platform, Marshal Ed Stringer, one of the most important thinkers in the MOD in recent years, in the services generally, RAF in particular. Ed was previously just retired as Director General of the Defence Academy. Before that, Assistant Chief Defence Staff, Assistant Chief of Air Staff, and before that, commanded operationally the Libyan air operation in 2011. It's a pleasure to have him here, as I say, a pleasure perhaps bittersweet from my point of view, because I'd admired your thinking during your career, and I think it's a great pity that some of the duller spirits in the services didn't seek to keep you in there, and that you were retired a few weeks ago. But the services loss is our gain here today for you to appear on our platform, and I know you've made a great effort to come back and forth from Yorkshire across the Pennines to come to be with us. You're not quite Victor Ladorum in terms of distance travelled, but it's still very welcome nonetheless. So Ed, thank you. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Dean. And I'm not sure about the distance culturally as opposed to geographically. You want to get on a Q&A, I'm sure, and speak to the other panellists. So I think I'll just limit what I'm going to say to 3 points. There's a narrative around Afghanistan, which is the narrative of defeat, which I don't buy. We'll do Afghanistan in another way, as the Secretary of State has pointed out. And let's spin that round and let's look at the narrative of the withdrawal from Afghanistan as an opportunity, and thought experiment, ask yourself the question. Would our foes and adversaries want us, if they could force it, would they want us to get involved in someone else's insurgency in one country in the global firmament that's going to consume somewhere around $2.5 trillion, but more importantly, a huge amount of the establishment bandwidth in thought, in the equipment program, in the way we develop our military thinking, the way we develop our officer corps. And of course, that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan. It really did skew the way the whole military was shaped. We became very good at counterinsurgency, low-tech warfare, just as our adversaries, and all the other panelists have brought this out, just as our adversaries returned with a vengeance, and having looked at what we were good and not so good at, and have started to compete in the high-tech realm. So we are freeing up that $2.5 trillion and that military bandwidth to think about that. And that brings you on to the second point. The integrated review absolutely recognises this, and I support it wholeheartedly, because at its heart is science and technology, and especially the domains of space and cyber, which I think have very, very strong similarities. We're going through the fourth and fifth industrial revolutions at the moment. They're absolutely pivotal. The whole of the socio-economy is changing, and military power always follows in the lee of an industrial revolution. Those who emerge in the head of that will be militarily powerful, economically powerful, and that will be politically powerful. The integrated review, therefore, is absolutely right on that. And of course, our way of life depends on the critical national infrastructure, a lot of which is in the cyber and space domains these days. Our way of life depends on the security of the financial system. That depends on confidence. It depends on the noughts and ones whizzing around the world, looking after your pensions and your investments and everything else that underpins our way of life. There are global commons out there in cyberspace, maritime and air that need defending, and they need defending with allies. You can't defend on the goal line and assume the world will stay away. The world can come at you at the speed of light through cyberspace and through space. And resilience, therefore, really needs to be a problem that you share and you solve with alliances, and the integrated review is very big on alliances. And my third point here is, I think that change is so pivotal that there's going to need to be some very significant reform in the military, and therefore, I commend what the Secretary of State has done with the command paper and the integrated operating concept, which is the way the military are going to have to transform to deliver the political intent of this country. I would argue that the Levine reforms of about a decade ago act against us. And I think, therefore, what the Secretary of State has done with the SONAC, the Office of Net Assessment and Challenge, is absolutely right. I would argue that it existed throughout the Afghan campaign. We might have made slightly different balanced investment decisions that would probably have left a slightly better place now. And I would argue that we need a stronger military strategic headquarters, because the services need to be absolutely whipped, to use a political phrase, into delivering what the command paper demands, so that the military can do its part in delivering its capacities that bring the integrated review to life. So I think for all of those reasons, the lessons of Afghanistan are that the integrated review needs to be doubled down on. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Ed, thank you for your most welcome contribution. I should say that also is a welcome reference to the Office of Net Assessment, which I'm enjoined on behalf of our staff here, not least Gabriel Eleftheriou, our head of research, that it was a policy exchange idea to bring the great Andrew Marshal, now deceased, his concept and offer of net assessment and turn it into a British form here in the MOD and within the wider national security community. So it's something that we welcome very much as well from our selfish point of view as a policy win. It's now my pleasure to welcome Stephen Harper, 22nd Prime Minister of Canada, great Canadian Prime Minister, but also, for our purposes here today, Chair of the International Democrat Union, the international alliance of centre-right parties globally. We're so honoured that you have come this distance. Always a pleasure to have you on our platform, and would just like to say a few minutes from a Canadian perspective on how you see our integrated review and our overall position in the world. Thank you.
Yeah, right. Thanks, Dean. First of all, thanks once again to Policy Exchange for having me. I'm always delighted to be here. As you will obviously recall, Alexander and I and others were recently involved in the Indo-Pacific Commission that this institute undertook, and I'm pleased to see a lot of its perspectives and recommendations reflected in the integrated review, which I really do think is a a really strong, comprehensive, modern vision for the United Kingdom in the world in the post-Brexit environment. I'm going to, rather than try and pull everything together, maybe just, Dean, restrict my comments to a question that was asked in the notes that were sent around for this, and that was really, where do all of us, Britain, where do all of us kind of position ourselves in this post-Afghanistan withdrawal situation where the United States appears to be increasingly moving towards unilateral action? Is that true? Is the United States essentially becoming unilateralist? And I think there is some degree of truth in that, but I think it's important that we understand why that is. It's not, as was speculated in the early days of Donald Trump, that this was a return to isolationism. I think what it is, rather, it's the United States moving away from what has been kind of considered its global leadership role. And this is, by the way, as true, in my judgment, as true under Joe Biden as it was under Donald Trump. And there are many reasons for that. I won't get into them, but basically the United States, I think increasingly, the American public really, more than these particular leaders, perceiving that so-called global leadership imposes upon them undue costs and burdens for which there is very little benefit and a loss of focus on American interests in the process. But this is not a consistent, I would say that any policy driven primarily by public opinion is not really a consistent policy. And this one is certainly not consistently applied. And we still see, in spite of this resistance to global leadership in the United States, we see this, we see the various administrations indulging in global leadership on a more random basis. Perfect example is Joe Biden on the issue of climate change, very much wanting the United States to position itself as a global leader on that particular challenge. But the biggest one, and the one most relevant to the integrated review, to Britain, and to our discussion here today, is the consensus that has developed in the United States, largely a grassroots consensus, but partly an elite consensus, and certainly a consensus among both parties now on the fact that the People's Republic of China represents a serious long-term challenge and risk to the United States on all of the dimensions that the integrated review touches upon, on security, on prosperity, on values. But, and you see that reflected not just in AUKUS, you see it reflected in the United States initiative around the Quad, very important, with Australia, Japan, and India. You saw it reflected in TPP, of course, ironically, the United States now not a member of that pact, but obviously that was an important part of this priority in United States foreign policy, on which it does want to show global leadership, and which it does want to have allies. So what is the importance? Because I think one of the pillars of the integrated review is that the United Kingdom, with all of both hard and soft power assets that it has, the United Kingdom still must act in the world with allies, and in particular with the United States. And whether we're frustrated with the United States or not, I think this is actually an unavoidable conclusion. When you look at those who can genuinely shape global events and genuinely provide leadership, I tell people around the world there are really only three options in terms of scale. One of them is the United States. A second option is the People's Republic of China, which is, for all kinds of reasons, not one that our countries would want to see assume global leadership. And the third is the European Union. European Union has the scale, but as you know better than I do, the European Union really lacks coherence when it comes to coherence and assets when it comes to global peace and security matters. So the key is engaging the United States, and how do we do that? And I'm basically, Dean, repeating some things I think I said here a couple of years ago. I think in this new world where the United States is reticent about global leadership, the real key elements to engaging the United States is, first of all, very cleared shared alignment, and if not shared general alignment, at least very shared objectives, which is why, of course, AUKUS works and is so important. Similarly, it's not just enough to have shared objectives with the United States anymore. The United States must see some shared burdens and shared advantages to it taking leadership and to it working closely with allies. So those things are going to be really important. But the third thing I just have to add is this: because of the way the United States is going, it will be very important to beware of the reality that U.S. priorities can shift, and can shift unexpectedly. Obviously, we saw that in Afghanistan. But look, I would even suggest don't rule it out in terms of the current forward-leaning, more aggressive posture towards the People's Republic of China. As I said, one of the key objectives of the Biden administration is to lead on climate change. And the United States already recognizes that it cannot make headway on climate change without the active cooperation of the People's Republic of China. This, by the way, I think is a really fundamental, unresolved element of American foreign policy right now. How do you take an aggressive tack towards China on peace and security and trade and technology matters, while at the same time wanting a close working relationship on the priority of climate change, which is a priority obviously not just for the United States, but for this country, with COP26 being held here. And that is completely unresolved. And Secretary Kerry, I think, was just given a bit of a lesson in that on his trip to Beijing, when the Chinese said to him, and I believe the wording was, there can be no oasis in the desert. Chinese can be annoying, but they have a great habit of turn of phrase. You have to give them credit for that. So look, this as I say, could detract. AUKUS on one hand fits one set of really clear American, British, Australian, and other priorities, but on the other hand runs in contradiction, as I say, to American priority on the climate change file, and that's going to have to be watched with some attention. Look, I'll just maybe wrap up there, Dean, but once again, appreciate the invitation. I look forward to some of your questions and discussion.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for outstanding winding up. I'd like to now throw it open for questions. Usual policy exchange house rules, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. And I know there's a lot of people who are looking. Lady at the back there. Sorry, if you'll just wait a second till the microphone comes through. If you just state your name and organisation, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Amy. I work for World Vision UK, and I was just wondering what the panel, what lessons the panel were taking from the integrated review in terms of aid and development, considering the wake of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
Well, I think the lesson is the same thing that we sort of said in the opening speeches. It's about being joined up and applying all our assets to a problem, whether that is aid, where aid runs into what I would call resilience. Alicia referred to training and assist. I mean, we are investing in what we're going to call the Ranger battalions, but they're effectively like the Green Beret model of the United States, where we go beyond just training. We go to training, assist, enabling. And some of that is enabling, as we already do. I had Royal Engineers in Sudan recently helping to build projects and dams and things like that in Sudan. It's important. So I think it's about the intelligent application of all our assets to fix problems. And sometimes that is security, sometimes that's aid in its purest form, and the integrated view. And the merger between DFID and Foreign Office was all about that. And I think what we'll see with hopefully the comprehensive spending review for the other departments will unlock a lot more of a long-term application of that, and we can all sit around the table and really apply to the problem. But it also means we have to prioritize. We're going to have to make some tough decisions about where we do that, where we get a return for it. And I would put one thing back onto other organizations, which is the UN. In Mali, there was something called the Algerian Agreement. We have a squadron of Chinooks supporting the French. We have MINUSMA, the UN, a deployment of UK forces, about 300 forces. But the nation building of Mali has just not happened. The education, the counter-radicalization, the anti-poverty, the anti-corruption. And that's why you're seeing no real change in the extremists and the terrorist threat And where has the UN been on that? We can't do one without the other. And I think that is the challenge for the wider aid community and the United Nations.
Anyone else want to come in from the panelists in response to that? Anyone else? Anybody? Nobody going, gone. Good. Lady over there had a question. If you just wait till the microphone comes over, name and organisation, please.
Hello, I'm Emily. I'm a councillor in Westminster North. I'm really fascinated by the focus on China and the brief mention about Russia, because it was only a couple of years since Salisbury, and we have suffered numerous cyber attacks. Do you think we've got to the point where the threat and influence of China has eclipsed the threat and influence of Russia, or is that just the focus of this particular Canada, Australia, UK shared threats?
Who'd like to come in first? Prime Minister, maybe.
Sure. Look, I think there is no doubt that in terms of long-term trajectory of the world, as I say, whether it's about our security, our values, or even our economic objectives, that China is far and away long-term both the most important threat, but the most important consideration. Russia, I hesitate to use John McCain's accurate but undiplomatic description of modern Putin's Russia as a gas station run by the mafia. But look, it's not that far off. Russia is, under Mr. Putin, in spite of, I say him consistently playing a poor hand well in terms of global influence, Russia is a declining player on all measures. The Russian economy is smaller. When we kicked Russia out of the G8, it's smaller than the Canadian economy. Russia was the smallest member of the G8. Russia's influence in the world is largely through one of the things, and others that you mentioned, it's largely through disruptive actions. Hacking, being a mercenary, being a troublemaker, disruptor of alliances, not someone who creates alliances, not a country, unlike China, that is projecting a model, either a model of an economy, a model of governance. It is simply a disruptor. It's a problem for all of us, and it's not an insignificant problem. But to suggest that, the future trajectory of peace and security in the world or of our own interests is in some way conditioned by Russia, I think is fundamentally inaccurate. China is the one we do have to focus on and worry about. And also the one, by the way, to be balanced here with advantages. China is also, for all of its worrisome direction under Xi Jinping, China also is in other ways a more constructive player than Russia, and certainly a greater potential economic opportunity for lots of economic interests in our country. So it is really the one we need to be focused on.
I know two other panelists, three other want to come in. Alexander Downer, then Alicia, then Matt.
I really just want to reinforce what Stephen Harper has been saying. I think, Russia is a Potemkin state. It looks powerful from the outside, but this is a pretty fragile sort of a state. And its capacity to project power, soft power, it has very little soft power, Russia, and to project hard power is very limited, and it is important to recognise its economy is actually not a very, and Stephen's made that point, it's not a very big economy. This means not to say Russia is in trouble. Russia is a lot of trouble around its borders, and by the way, I think it always will be. And Russia is a negative player, is a disruptor. But when you get to the Indo-Pacific region, which is the growing region of the world, where the center of global geopolitical gravity is moving, Russia is almost, not quite, but is a very, put it this way, is a very minor player. And so you might be thinking, as the last point I'd make, that Russia has bonded with China. I don't think so. I think from China's point of view, a massively bigger player than Russia. Russia is a useful partner, but I don't think the Chinese see the long-term relationship as a particular important. So I think it's easy to overstate the importance of Russia and the threat of Russia. And it is easy sitting here in Manchester to underestimate the huge problem we have with an increasingly aggressive and growing China.
Thank you. Alicia.
I'll keep it brief because I agree with both the previous panelists, but I think it's also about different backyards. Russia and China both remain threats, but the fact is that we haven't focused enough on China. That is nothing new. We all know that, which is why we are all talking about China so much now, because we are playing catch up. It doesn't mean we're not doing very well, but this is about longevity of threat. And when we look at that, if the integrated review, China has to be the priority because of things like money that we've touched on, so on, instability of the state. Both China and Russia, it's all about what's happening internally determines their externals, but Russia is far more unstable there. The one thing I would say is that the reason we have to be more strategic on China is because of the way they run their state and the security of their authority and rule within their own country. Whereas Russia, we have a tendency in the past to say we're highly strategic and highly effective in these great masterminds, probably helped by James Bond movies suggesting that Russian enemies are somehow geniuses. But actually what you find with Russia is they throw 1,000 things at the wall and they see what sticks. And then they throw everything at those few things that stick. Whereas with China, we need to fundamentally recognize the strategic nature, the way they're buying things up, forcing reliance on them, their plunder diplomacy, and that's why they're fundamentally different and why we have to come together as nations together to counter it, whereas actually UK and the Russia is a more specific conflict than perhaps other nations face.
Matt Turpin.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a little bit of a different point. I think it's a mistake for us to think of this as a choice. Both Moscow and Beijing view the liberal international system as existential threats to their regime types, and so there is an alliance of convenience, not an alliance as we would define it in sort of long-term democracies that align and sign things, but sort of 19th century alliances of convenience in which they both see that there are common threats in the world to them, and that they will work together. And I think that's an important part of it. And I think the other part is that the world is just much smaller today than what we sort of think, right? I think it's incredibly important for us to sort of set aside these sort of regional choices, right? We face global challenges in cyber, in space, in interference ops, in economic coercion. These are global challenges that don't necessarily have terrestrial aspects to them, right? Now, certainly both countries have real terrestrial sort of threats that they provide, right? If you're Taiwan, you feel there's a significant threat, right? If you're Japan, right? And if you're in Eastern Europe. But that is not the totality of what Moscow and Beijing present. They present global challenges. And we are forced to deal with those. And it would be nice to sort of focus on one over the other, right? But I don't think we can wish that world away. We're going to have to deal with the world we have. And increasingly, they see themselves as well aligned.
Thank you. I see a lot of other questions. If we'll, perhaps like in the Dien Bien Phu peace talks of 1954, we can stop the clocks for a few minutes, please, for 5 more minutes. But if I can take questions in braces. 2 ladies in front here, if we could just take one after the other. Name and organisation, please.
Juliet Samuel, Telegraph, also a fellow at Policy Exchange. Alexander Downie, you talked about the need for democracies to rally together, but I wonder if you and others on the panel think that we have the will to do that yet, because you still meet an astonishing number of prevaricators on China and the threat from China across particularly the corporate business sector, politicians in this country, on the back of their influence in universities and business interests in this country. So it seems to me we have a lot of work to do to convince people or elites in this country that this is a problem. And just briefly, secondly, I wonder if the nuclear submarines of the AUKUS deal will ever get built, or when they might. Thank you.
Lady behind you. Question.
So apologies, I'm also from the Telegraph. I'm the defence correspondent, Danielle
You speak
Sheridan.
up just so people can hear your name, sorry.
Danielle Sheridan, defence correspondent at the Telegraph. I wanted to know, how do you think the UK will manage any future threats emanating from Afghanistan post-op pitting? And also, Ben, are soldiers who served in op pitting going to get medals for their work? Thank you.
If I just add a third question, because there are so many gentlemen behind you has been waiting very patiently. So your name and organisation, sir.
My name is Robin White. Until recently, I was an honorary colonel in 77 Brigade, which is the Army's Information Warfare Brigade. My question relates to our ability to have a cohesive ideology about kinetic warfare. That as we expand the role of soft power, there wasn't a lot about what I have called information peacefare in the integrated review, and I'm wondering whether this can be more further developed, because this is going to be more of our military and non-military future. I think we've got more thinking to do, perhaps.
Brilliant, thank you. Ed Stringer, you've dealt with a lot of these issues in your recent professional career. Some thoughts?
Yes, let's take the last one. The kinetic stuff hasn't gone away. The information stuff, you have to wrap around it. In the narrative sense, which I think is where you're coming from 77 Brigade, yes, that can get quite political, but I think the integrated review addresses that. I just reinforce what some folk have said, that we're not just issuing the military with keyboards and everything else has gone away, but even the latest army vehicle doesn't drive out the gates of Colchester without a mission data set and a download. So everything is cyber dependent these days. So the two are very much related. I'll leave the submarine question, sadly. But the managing the threats from Afghanistan, in many ways, as Secretary of State has mentioned, there are lots of other countries that will provide the seed corn for the terrorist threat, and will provide some form of base of it, and we will have to manage Afghanistan as we manage many of those. And once again, it comes back to the whole question why this panel is here today. It comes back to alliances and partnerships. And it'll shift more from the military domain, more into the diplomatic and more into the intelligence services. But it'll be managed, therefore, as I say, as we do in many other countries. And those who took over from me in the job will be working on the exact ways that happens, and sadly, that'll be classified.
Secretary of State.
Okay, Dean. So first of all, on Afghanistan and the CT threat, outside in, we are in a different world from sort of 2000. We have capabilities now that can allow us reach from outside in to take whatever action we have to in accordance with international law to protect ourselves. It's not optimal. It's never as good as being on the ground alongside partners, but we have those capabilities, and we will use them as necessary, and we've invested in them. Part of the Defence Command paper talked about investing in another generation of UAVs, the protector drones and things like that, but also in other capabilities about being able to deliver something if we have to. And I think the wrap of information is important. I totally agree with Ed Stringer about the Levine report, not just in net assessment. I arrived as security minister to the MOD to find a department that wasn't, in my view, threat orientated. It didn't campaign every day. It didn't campaign to defend our interests and our allies in a way that our adversaries campaign every day on either side of the threshold. And that is a whole mindset, a cultural change. It's an organizational change. We need to recognize that we have to be on it all the time, and we have to think, how to imply intelligently, but also clear away the legal permissions that we often need around information ops, kinetic ops, but also diplomatic permissions so we can share with partners internationally. And so I've started, my priority this side of the reshuffle is head office reform, as we're gently calling it, but it is in fact going to be thinking about strategic strategic direction, campaigning. The lesson that comes through in Afghanistan around, a quick fix or managing the problems in the world and longevity is that, modern campaigns are like political campaigns. I'm a conservative. I will campaign for the conservative way of doing things for 20, 30, 40 years. It won't sort of stop, right, just because I lose my job or I come out of politics. Campaigning for what we believe is enduring. Campaigning to defend ourselves is something that we need to do all the time. And we've got into a mindset in the military that campaigning is a sort of big event where someone fires a starting pistol and you have a vote in Parliament and off you go and do op shader, and then it all comes to a neat end. And that's the idea of a campaign. But actually modern, both military and other types of campaigns are enduring, and we have to get into that mindset. And I think our head office does not support us in being able to do that, either from the military leadership or the political leadership, and that is the next stage we're going to do and deliver. Now, on medallic recognition, I understand it's really important. It is, a question that comes up every few years in whatever conflict around the world. What people did in Op Pitting was extraordinary. In extraordinary environment, we shouldn't underestimate, and as Prime Minister formerly said, without the US, we wouldn't have been able to do it. Let's not forget that. We can debate the decision to leave, but the 82nd Airborne, division, when it went in there, the thousands of people, that allowed all of the other countries, including the United Kingdom, to extract their people. It was extraordinary, fast-moving. We proved we could do things in those high-stress environments, and of course we'll reflect on whether there's medallic recognition specifically for it. Remember, there is always medallic recognition for the gallantry and the organisational skills that are demonstrated in whatever conflict that is for our service personnel. So that is a separate programme, but obviously we'll reflect on that. And the thing about medallic recognition, it has to reflect the modern world. Much more is done from the UK on these type of things than there used to be. We often sort of say the brain is less forward sometimes than it is. It's often, held back. And so how do we recognise all those people that are contributing to that? And it's an ongoing debate, but we will look at it. And look, on the submarines, I think it's really important, AUKUS. I mean, AUKUS says something about Australia's ambition. I mean, I think it is a really strategic decision which doesn't come along many times in people's lives. They're big decisions where you don't always know the full outcomes of the decision you make. It's like, shall I get married? It's one of those decisions you never clearly know how it's going to work out. And my father said you only make about 3 or 4 of those decisions in your lives. And deciding to do that is an extremely committed. You have to be really committed to grow a nuclear, effectively an industry and a nuclear capability. It's not something you go and buy off a shelf. It is perfectly logical that the partners they were going to choose were going to come from within the Five Eyes. Of course it was. In trying to sort of temper France, fundamentally this was not about, France shouldn't take it personally. This was about, once they made that decision to change from a diesel-electric submarine capability to a nuclear in order to remain undetected and below surface for very long periods of time, it was inevitable that the Five Eyes was the partners they'd come and seek that from, and that's just, I'm afraid, the way it is. Delivering them, I can tell you, I've got Dreadnought and Astute and SNR on my chit. Unfortunately for BAE, I live about an hour and a half from Barrow-in-Furness, so I'm regularly around there to check up on its issues. I don't tell them, but I'm planning a sort of middle of the night inspection when they're not expecting it. So actually, about an hour away, actually. And they are the most complex things on Earth. So we will lean in with the Australians, we will lean in with the United States, we will pull together all our knowledge to help them get that capability. Their ambition is sort of late 2030s, 2040s, so we have time. I believe we will be able to do it, be able to deliver. It fits with our cycles. We've just kicked off the SNR, the next generation of submarines, of hunter-killer submarines. The United States are in full flow. So I think we're in a strong position to help the Australians achieve that capability. So I'm very confident that British engineering, British skills, Australian nous will deliver a very good submarine.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're out of time today. My apologies to anyone who's not been able to ask a question. Please send them in to us and we'll gladly pass them on to any of the panellists. I just think you'll all agree with me. It's been an outstanding panel today. Thank you to all. I also like it when panellists applaud themselves, like the Soviet Politburo. So that's anyhow, thank you all for coming. It's not the last we've heard from us on this. Thank you.